Welcome to the Rachel Lang Show. I am your host and astrologer, Rachel Lang, and I am thrilled to have one of my very favorite people and one of my very favorite astrologers with me today for this very special episode to talk about a recent article, a recent Substack article that was written by Adam Grant called "We Need to Talk About Astrology." Many of us astrologers have had questions coming to us about this article, and the article is an attempt to debunk astrology and to actually say that it's not accurate, that it's not real, that it's not true. And so I'm welcoming today my very special guest, Rick Levine, who is an incredible, he is one of the master astrologers of our time. Rick was the co-founder of Star IQ. He's been a professional astrologer since 1976. He's one of the leaders in astrology in globally. He's been recognized, won significant awards. He's written several books. He appears regularly on the Astrology Hub. He teaches and leads workshops all over the world. And I am thrilled to consider him my friend. And I can't wait to have this conversation with him. So welcome, Rick.
I'm just as thrilled to be here as you are to have me here. Yeah, lovely.
Great, great. So, Rick, I usually start every episode with a forecast with an overview of what is happening this week. And so this week, we go from Thursday to Thursday. We start on March 21st, so just a few days after the astrological new year, and one of the more significant weeks of the year because this is the week of an eclipse. So I thought we could talk about what are some of the big signatures that we can look forward to this week. What is our forecast? Before we get into our main topic, let's give a little preview of what we can expect to come. Is there any transit or anything that you're looking at that you really wanted to start with or wanted to focus on?
Yes, I'm notorious for when being asked what's the most important aspect, let's say, of 2019, I said, oh, that would be January 20th of 2020. And what's the most important aspect of this next week? Well, it's the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction on April 20th. That's the most important thing this week because it gets rattled in different ways this week.
Mm-hmm. And let's spell out that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction is, let's talk a little bit about what that means. And in your assessment, what is the significance of that transit that's coming later on in April?
The significance of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction is very, very simple. When two planets join, their energies in some way magnify or interact or compress one another. And roughly every 14 years, the 12-year cycle of Jupiter catches up to Uranus. And Jupiter and Uranus have something in common, and that is they're both in their own ways expansive. Mm-hmm. Jupiter is expansive, but because it's inside the orbit of Saturn, it's only expansive up to the limits of the social structures, which is why Jupiter is the ruler of things like philosophy and logic. It's our opinions, but we have to justify them. So Jupiter is expansive, it's opening, it's opportunistic, it's growth-oriented. Now, Uranus, which is the first planet outside of Saturn, is expansive also, but it does it like lightning striking. Mm-hmm. And so when the planet of opening our minds meets the planet of instantaneous light bulb going off, the lightning striking, the awareness, something cool can happen if you're wanting it to happen. Now, for those people who are living their lives in denial, and unfortunately, that's a lot of us, when this kind of event happens, it may not be nearly as much fun because it might be something that comes to them that they don't want to know or something that they still have to resist, which can create some difficulties. But overall, every 14 years, when Jupiter catches up to Uranus, it's a period of time, not of a day, not even of a week, but of months of actually breaking through the boundaries of what we thought were the structures and opening up the potential to what lay beyond.
Absolutely. And one thing I love about that transit too is that if we look back historically, it is a time when we're giving birth to new ideas, new innovations,
technologies.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that really sets a stage for this week's eclipse, this week's, Venus Saturn conjunction, this week's Venus sextile, all of the transits that we have going on this week, I think really lay some groundwork for that. So let's talk about the let's just go dive right in and talk about the eclipse on March 25th.
Sure, and in doing that, let's remember that to the ancients, whether it was the ancient Greeks in the Hellenistic period or the ancient Indian, Jyotish, Vedic, Hindu astrologers, that eclipses were pretty frightening because they didn't have the understanding of celestial mechanics that we have. And therefore, eclipses hold a lot of negativity from the zeitgeist of astrologers. And in my experience, they can be negative if you've been doing your fair share of denial, or how to say this gently, bad shit.
Exactly. They love to catalyze change and to move us forward to whatever it is that it like puts us directly in the line of our own North Node.
Yeah, you hit the two important words: catalyze and change. And I would add a third word, and that would be either portal or vortex or something, because when the new moon or full moon happens close to the nodal axis, that's where the orbit of the moon around the Earth intersects the orbit of the Earth around the sun. I know you know this, I'm saying this for the general other people, but when the new moon or full moon happens close to that point where the Earth's orbit around the sun intersects the moon's orbit around the Earth, there's a bit of time warping magic that occurs that takes us out of the physical three-dimensional realms and puts us into other time-space realities or whatever. And so when you have an eclipse, there's that element going on also.
I love that. The magic of breaking the time-space continuum.
Yeah. Yeah, I always think of, it's almost like, we have electricity in our homes, and we can get, like, what do you call that? A dimmer on our living room light. And let's say we have that dimmer on that light, and over the course of 2 weeks, we go from complete dark, and over 2 weeks, it goes to maximum light. And then over 2 weeks, it goes to maximum dark. And then while it's maximum light 2 weeks later, all of a sudden someone grabs a hold of that switch and goes on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off. And then it goes back to the 2 weeks thing again. And that's why eclipses are like, and I don't mean this I don't mean this medically, but it's almost like an epileptic syndrome that comes up because this catalyst is like, it's like polarizing and flipping the energy in ways that it isn't normally flipped. So it puts us almost like hypnotically, it throws us out of where we are into some other place. And that's why things can happen so dramatically and so powerfully.
Right. And I think it's neither. I think with anything that's happening during the eclipse, you can't judge it like this is a good event or this is a bad event, because it is. I love that analysis of just the lights going on and off really fast. It's whatever needs to happen for that breakthrough happens.
Yeah.
Let's look at the chart for this eclipse. Here we go. And I just put the chart for those who are listening and not watching. I put the chart for it's March 25th, 2024 at 12 o'clock a.m. Pacific time. And so I put the chart for 0 degrees Aries, and it'll be a different rising sign for wherever you are located. So we're just doing the natural houses for this chart that I have up right now. And one thing that we were talking about just before you before we started the recording, and as we were just, talking shop a little bit about this eclipse, one thing that I heard you say that I haven't heard any other astrologers talking about, which is very important, is the leading of Uranus at the point of Thor. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, very simply, as astrologers, we divide a cycle into 12. That's the 12 signs of the zodiac. And as astrologers, we make angles between those signs, which are based upon numbers that divide evenly into 12. 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's what makes 12 magical, and 6. But when we divide other numbers into 12, like 8, although it doesn't come out evenly, those are incredibly potent and powerful aspects. In fact, it was the brilliant astronomer, astrologer, mathematician Johannes Kepler who gave us what we call the half square or semi-square, and the square and a half, or the sesqui, just like sesquicentennial is 150 years, a sesqui-square is 1.5 squares. And so these are angles of a half of 90 degrees, 45, and 45 plus 90, 135. Now, for those of you mathematically impaired, the important thing is to understand that there is a configuration in astrology called Thor's hammer, which has to do with this sesqui square and a half pattern. And so I've labeled the point in an opposition, and the lunar eclipse is the moon at 5 degrees 7 minutes Libra, opposing the sun at 5 degrees 7 minutes Aries, and Uranus at 20 degrees, 20 and a half degrees, almost 20 degrees and 28 minutes Taurus, is 45 degrees, or 1/2 of a square to the sun, and it's 135 degrees, or a square and a half to the moon. And so Uranus kind of acts like the thorn in our foot that makes the irritation so severe that we have to stop and figure out what's going on and take that damn thorn out of our foot and then medicate it. Mm-hmm. And so when you have a planet that's making an aspect to both sides of an opposition, it becomes a key point. And most astrologers who look at just the quote unquote zodiac aspects, the sextiles, trines, squares, and quincunxes and so on, don't spend the time that they need to, I think, with the semi and sesqui-square. And so there's a strong Uranian influence here. And the reason why that's important is that if you look at this chart, you can see that Jupiter is just barely at 16 degrees of Taurus. It's 15 degrees and 56 minutes, 4 minutes away from being at 16 degrees of Taurus. And that is basically showing us that Jupiter, which is moving faster than Uranus as it does, is coming into that conjunction. And so this eclipse is like an early warning foreshadowing of the energy that's happening over this next month, as we build into not only through another eclipse on April 8th, but into the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that we've already talked about. But let's not be sidetracked that this is still an eclipse in Aries to Libra, which is basically the basic polarity of the universe is self and not self. It's any cycle that has a beginning, Aries, and a halfway point, Libra, where you're confronted by the inner and the outer, or the polar opposites, whatever they are. And so that's really what's behind all of this, this eclipse. And then the other thing is just look at the density of planets in Pisces and Aries, and that in itself is just such an interesting statement, because we are in a time of such focus between the ending of one cycle, Pisces, the last sign of the zodiac, and Aries, the beginning of the next cycle, the first sign of the zodiac. And that's the deeper rhythm of what's going on now and over the next couple of years even.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And what do you think about, speaking of Aries and the endings and the beginnings, what do you think about the North Node's position in Aries and how this eclipse is going to activate that?
Well, as the proud owner of a North Node in Aries natally, it's hard for me to really comment on it because it's just part of who I am, and it's hard to differentiate it from everything else. But, in some ways, the nodes appear to be directional, in as much as they appear to, in some way, emphasize what physicists call time's arrow. And the arrow of time goes from the past to the future, meaning that once you drop a glass and break it, you can't just automatically reverse that and put it back together. That there's a law of physics that goes from simplicity to complexity. And as such, that North Node in Aries, I think, is directing us toward paying attention to a keyword for Aries that many people miss. And the keyword is enthusiasm. And people think of enthusiasm and they think, oh, I'm excited. That's enthusiasm. No, as you know, I'm an etymology freak. Words mean something, whether we know it or not. And the word enthusiasm means theos, with God. And it's because God, no matter what religion you are, and whether you're any sort of theist or atheist, the concept of God is a no subject object differentiation. It's God is one. Now, there can be many gods and many different traditions, but the concept of with God means that there is that moment of creation, and there is unity in self. And of course, that self then evolves ultimately into the Libra. It's interesting that, of course, I am an Aries and you are a Libra. And so we represent this polarity in some sort of manifestation here on Earth. But I think that the significance of the North Node in Aries, along with the Sun in Aries, and along with the recent conjunction of Mercury and Chiron in Aries, coming up to over the next weeks, Venus and Mars also going through Aries, lining up with Chiron still close to the node, we have a potential for healing. It's not an easy potential. And, Chiron often, I think there's a lot of people out there that think Chiron's last name is the wounded healer.
Right.
And it's not. Chiron is the original mentor.
Right.
Chiron is in some ways the go-between between Saturn and Uranus, and it represents that breakthrough that happens when we learn something, because Chiron was the teacher of Asclepius, the teacher of Hercules. And so from that standpoint, Chiron often is associated with original wounds. Yeah, you could think on a cosmological level, original sin. That's okay with me, because as humans, we all carry the defect of being limited by the three-dimensional world. And we all have our chironic, limitations. But with Mercury lining up with Chiron as it is now, and as it was over the last few days, and the node, the nodal axis backing up over Chiron as it has over these last few weeks, and the sun coming into Chiron, and the node as we approach the next eclipse, 2 weeks down the road,
which is April 8th.
April 8th, we have this opportunity to learn or to forgive and or to teach, because all of these things are tied to the places in our lives where we're afraid to take in new information, because it's like rubbing salt on an old wound that we don't know is fixable or healable. And therefore, I think we have a tremendous opportunity through this whole period of time that has to do with relationship, with self, Aries, versus, or not versus, but being in coordination with not self, Libra.
Right.
Relationship.
And I think one thing that you said at the beginning too is that Aries and Libra, this axis line is about polarity and integration. It's about the sense of separateness and the ways in which we come together. And so I think that that also, aligns with what you're saying about Chiron's influence. I always think of healing in healing processes as one repair, but also it's an integration when we're talking about it in terms of emotional healing, psychological healing, spiritual reconnection. So
Yeah. And I think the problem with Aries, or with the North Node in Aries, or any planets in Aries, and I can speak to this as someone who carries over the legal limit of planets in Aries natally. The problem with it, I think, can be summarized by this wonderful quote by the crazy wisdom master Trungpa Chogyam Rinpoche, the founder of Naropa, the Buddhist college in Boulder, who said, "Enlightenment is the ego's greatest disappointment."
mm,
Enlightenment is the ego's greatest disappointment because, and this now comes back to the planets in Pisces versus Aries, because Aries is the illusion that all there is me, God, that singularity, when in fact there's always a subject-object differentiation. Now, here's the problem. In Pisces, we realize that the ego, the me, Rick Levine, the you, Rachel Lang, that's an illusion. We are all part of something that is the Piscean waters of spirit that flow through all of us. The illusion is that spirit encapsulated in a body, we call that soul, makes it seem like you and I are separate. And so I think that this eclipse is affording us the potential to look at these incredible extreme bifurcations that's plaguing the planet right now, whether it's vaccination, anti-vax, Trump, anti-Trump, Palestine, Israel, abortion versus, I don't even want to call it right to life, but you know the issues. I mean, and in a way, all of these extreme bifurcations are in some ways Aries Libra polarities. And these two eclipses, but this one right now in Aries Libra, the March 25th one, is basically an awareness of how tight this wire, this tightrope, this tension is between the two sides. And Uranus basically at that point is, it reminds me of, I think it's hexagram 28. God, I haven't looked at this in a long time, but the words in the I Ching are the ridge pole, which is the thing that holds up a bridge. The ridge pole sags to the breaking point. It furthers the great man to have somewhere to go. In other words, the tension is so great that something's going to break, something's going to snap, and we're all going to be running one way or another, trying to get it together. And this is where we are at culturally. And I think it's represented by this eclipse. And let's not forget also that this eclipse is on the tail end of the moon's trine to Pluto and the sun's sextile to Pluto. In fact, one could say that as Uranus is exacerbating, making a problem by its half square and square and a half to the eclipse, Pluto is the release point. That's the point of Thales that is allowing the energy to flow. And what does that mean? It means we need to let go and go into the hell realms. And I don't mean the Christian hell where we go to get punished. I mean the hell realms where magic occurs, where death becomes life, where magic happens, where we're not in control. Again, it's the illusion of Aries being in control, but it takes going into those plutonic realms to let go of that ego. Remember, enlightenment is the ego's greatest disappointment. And I think that's part of what this eclipse is all about.
wow, that really beautifully sums it up. It's intense, it's cathartic, and one of the things I think that during anytime we're talking about Pluto, what we're talking about is the willingness to surrender to what the ego holds on to. So, like you were saying, I love that quote. The ego is that enlightenment is the ego's greatest disappointment. All
It's a
right.
good mantra. I think of that almost every day, not every
Uh,
day, but
uh-huh.
rarely does a day go by where I don't just think of that and smile. And look, I mean, with 4 planets in Aries and a number of other fire sign planets, I have a strong ego. And yet I also understand that it's just, all illusion. And I'm okay with that.
Good. Well, that is anything else you want to talk about the astrology of this week?
Well, there's always more
Yeah.
to talk about. I think that that Mars going into Pisces is also an interesting piece, especially because as Mars goes through Pisces, I always look at all these events as being part of larger cycles, which is why I said the most important event this week is the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in late April. Everything is leading to something else. And as Mars moves from Aquarius, where it knows everything, it's sharp-edged, it's crystallized, it has a perspective. As Mars moves into Pisces, the fog rolls in, and it becomes lost. It becomes non-directive. In fact, if Mars is a warrior planet, it becomes in Pisces the spiritual warrior who knows the only fight it can fight is internally. Now, that's separate from the fact that as Mars moves through Pisces, which it now has begun, it's on the tip of beginning to do, is that it basically has two important dates. I mean, it has a date with Saturn and it has a date with Neptune. And this fact that as Mars goes through Pisces, it has to do its boundary setting and fighting with two planets that arguably are stronger than Mars. And Saturn says, whoa, you got to be kidding me. Stop. And then it goes to Neptune that goes, there's no boundaries here anyhow. And all of this to me is representative, again, of a larger cycle of Saturn catching up to Neptune, even though it doesn't occur until February of 2026, which seems far away. The fact is that Saturn and Neptune are cohabitating. They're living in the same house right now. They're living under the same roof of Pisces. And Neptune has been saying, dissolve, 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 fake news, nothing's real. We're all, and Saturn is saying, give me real, I'm the authority, I'm going to make this, and so on. And as Mars comes through it, again, we're getting this fractal kind of like glimpse at what the larger picture is over the next couple of years as Mars moves through Pisces, lines up with Saturn, and then lines up with Neptune, and then moves into Aries, just like Saturn and Neptune will over the next year or so.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And this is all happening in April. So this is all
happening in April.
And sort of Mars can join Saturn on the 10th. Mars enters Aries on the 30th, and that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction is happening right there on the 20th. So
on the 20th, yeah.
April
And the thing is, and the thing is that's important to understand is that these rhythms, these larger harmonies are already in the music, even though we don't get to experience the moment of it until a little bit later on. It's all part of the setup. And so in a way, this week, or I really should say the last week plus of March is basically this setup of indeterminacy of we can go either way. Anyone who says that they can predict what's going to happen over the next year or two should not be believed, because we're in this state of quantum indeterminacy where the field is pregnant with change, but the lightning hasn't struck fully yet, and we don't know how it's going to precipitate, which is why it becomes important to act in a manner that is conducive with the way in which we want this to unfold, even though things aren't unfolding until April and even May, June, July, and 2025 and 2026. You can't wait until then to start, because by then it will be too late.
Yes. Yes. And that is a great segue to talking about Adam Grant's article. Yep. And so the article, the title of the article, it's a Substack article, is "We Need to Talk About Astrology."
Yes, we do.
Yes, we do. And the first few paragraphs, or the first paragraph, just to set up, to lay down some groundwork, he writes, "It brings me no joy to do this. Honestly, I've been avoiding it for years. But Capricorn, I can't stay silent any longer. This is an intervention. You're addicted to astrology.
I want to take I want to take exception with his opening line. It brings me no joy to do this, because he is gloating as he's writing it. The whole lean of this article is he is so joyful at being able to do this. It starts off with what a psychologist would note that is a symptom of schizophrenia. Not that I'm saying that this man is schizophrenic, but it's called an acute denial. That a schizophrenic will often start a conversation with an acute denial. And he's saying, this brings me no joy to do this, and I'm calling him on it. That's bullshit.
Okay, so acute. So he starts with acute denial. Why do you think he's so satisfied? Why do you think he's deriving joy from debunking astrology?
You know, there's a saying that it's as easy as shooting fish in a barrel. Not that I recommend that. Let me be clear. That in his mind, astrology is such a popular, quote unquote, belief system, and based upon what he thinks he knows about astrology, and we'll get to that in just a moment, he just thinks it's an easy. It's like as easy as shooting fish in a barrel. It gives me no joy to do this, but I'm going to do this, and you're going to be amazed at how stupid the rest of the world is, and how easy it is to show how smart you are.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think about, obviously I have some thoughts about this too, but I'm curious to hear, he is quoting the article goes on to talk about a study that was done at MIT. And it was an MIT led team decided to collect data in China, and the whole study concluded that that of the personalities, 55% of the participants were believers, 50% the others weren't. And basically, this study found that there really weren't the commonalities between the different sun signs.
All right, let me start off.
Go ahead.
With the title of his talk is "We Need to Talk About Astrology." All right, there's a story that this young, kind of radical, rebellious upstart of a teenager goes into confession, and he sits down and he says to the priest, he goes, "Before we start this confession, I need to tell you that I don't believe in God." And the priest says, "Oh, that's fine. I don't believe in God either." And the kid now is like shocked. He goes, what do you mean you don't believe in God?" And the priest says, "I don't believe in the God that you don't believe in. I don't believe in the astrology that Adam Grant doesn't believe in." So on one hand, I could say, okay, I agree with your whole article, but there's a deeper problem. But the fact of the matter is that when Adam Grant says we need to talk about astrology, what he is really saying is, I need to talk about something that I call astrology, that is a simplified, watered down public assumption about one little piece of astrology, that although astrology existed for some 2,000 years plus that we know of, that this part of astrology has only existed for 120 years. And I'm going to say that all astrology is this, and he doesn't even know he's doing that, which basically then, brings me to a quote that I mentioned before we went on air from one of my science heroes, and that is a man named Richard Feynman, who many people know as a Nobel Prize winning physicist who created a whole logic structure for analyzing subatomic particle interactions on the quantum field. And he was also the guy who figured out the Challenger disaster and what happened there, kind of in contrariness to everything that everyone else was thinking. And what Richard Feynman wrote was, "I believe that a scientist looking at non-scientific problems is just as dumb as the next guy. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool." That scientists have an absolute narrow focus on what they know, and as soon as they step outside of that realm, they really have no reason to say anything. And I think more than anything else, and we'll drill down on this, what Adam Grant represents here, to anyone who really knows what astrology is, knows that Adam Grant has basically transgressed the first primal rule of not only science but academia in general, and that is Adam Grant did not do the research, because he's talking about things that he is imagining to be real, and it has nothing to do with the astrology that you do or I do or Jennifer Freed, who I know has answered him in Substack, does. That there is something out there that Adam Grant and many scientists have no idea about, because they've already a priori made the judgment that astrology is bullshit, it can't work, and therefore why read any research on it? Now he pulls one piece of research out of the air, and we can talk about why that doesn't make a case for anything he's talking about in a moment. But that's my immediate response, is that astrology suffers from a deep PR problem, whereas the public perception of what astrology is has very little to do with the academic intellectual precepts of astrology that, whether Adam Grant likes it or not, has created the entire Western scientific, philosophical, and dare I say it, even religious tradition.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And just to simplify what you're saying, Adam Grant and this study in particular are just talking about sun sign astrology. The astrology that many of us practice involves looking at the mathematical field of harmonics, tying in psychology. I mean, it ties all intellectual disciplines together in a mathematical form.
Yeah, and just, to clarify what you're saying and to make this a little bit more specific, in the late 50s and through the 60s and even into the 70s, a French statistician studying at the Sorbonne, a man named Michel Gauquelin, basically set out as his master's thesis in statistics to disprove astrology, because he knew it was bullshit. And I'm simplifying and slanting this story a little bit to make my point. But in France, since the French Revolution, it was a national law to have birth times on all live birth certificates. So he had a huge database to go on, and he calculated basically charts by hand, because this was before computers, of, I think his original study, I think it was 35,000 birth data, basically trying to show that based upon your sun sign, which is what this Chinese study is on sun sign, to basically show that Aries didn't tend anymore to be soldiers, and Pisces, intuitive healers or magicians or whatever, then their sun signs might suggest that there was no correlation between sun sign and career. And he absolutely showed that. But as he began to dig into the data, he came across something else that was, in some ways, unavoidable, overpowering, and quite threatening. And what he came across was the absolute statistical validation for the correlation between a planet that happened to have been on the ascendant, on the eastern horizon, or near the medium Celli, the midheaven, the point closest to the zenith that a planet, the sun, or any planet gets at high noon, or to the descendant, the western horizon, or to the imium Celli, the point that's beneath one's feet. In effect, the 90-degree angle, the cross that would. And when a planet was close to those points, people who, for example, excelled in sports or in the military overwhelmingly tended to have Mars at one of those points. Didn't matter whether they were an Aries or a Pisces or a Vegetarius, is that a sign? Or whatever. It didn't matter. What mattered was the planet that was closest to these points seemed to have a direct correlation. And he did this with several planets and several different careers. And he ended up writing books called Neo-Astrology, books about, the statistics involved in looking at astrology and taking it away from what was in the past called astrology. And let's be clear that what you and I call astrology, that your sun sign, which is the only thing in astrology that is consistent year to year, because the Western world from the Roman calendar uses a solar or sun-based calendar, which means that every year on April 10th, the sun is in Aries. Every year on March 22nd or March 15th, the sun is in Pisces. And so it's the only consistency thing year to year has to do with the Earth's orbit around the sun. And there is no astrologer in the world who would say that that is astrology, because in order to begin to understand any of the depth and integrity of what real astrology is, and we have not yet really defined that, but we can in a few minutes, would know that it's not just about the Earth's relationship to the sun, it's also about the moon's relationship to the Earth. And in fact, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, maybe Chiron, maybe Pallas, maybe another 250,000 things that NASA tracks going around the sun, that it's way more complicated than the gross oversimplification that basically takes the premise that Adam Grant is stating and makes him sound like a fool. Now, I don't believe Adam Grant's a fool. I've read some of his stuff. He's a smart boy. He's actually when it comes to industrial psychology or social psychology, the guy's got real intellect. He's very clever, but he stepped outside of what his area of knowledge is, and by focusing astrology on the sun sign is basically a total gross misrepresentation and bastardization of what astrology really is. And that's where we start off with the problems that he has. I mean, aside from the fact that the whole thing is done to bring him joy, even though he says it brings me no joy. He goes, I know what you're thinking. That's exactly what a Scorpio would say. Nice try, but I'm an Aries. That he's lying to us if he's telling the truth. No, the fact is that he's not an Aries. He's a Leo. Not that he cares. And quite frankly, not that I care either, because I would care more about not that he was born with the sun in Leo, but that he was born with the moon most likely in Capricorn, or that there was a 1/3 of a circle relationship between his sun and Neptune. Oh, here we are looking at
and
Adam's.
Here's his chart. I just pulled up his chart.
Now, in all fairness, we don't know his chart because the word horoscope technically is not what he's even writing about, because a horoscope is a Greek word like telescope, far, scope, scopus, far away. A scopus means to see. So telescope is to see far. Microscope is to see tiny. Horo, hour, Greek for hour. A horoscope is to see the hour. And we don't know what hour he was born, so we do not have a horoscope. We have a map of where the planets were on the noon that he was on the noon of at noon on the day that he was born. But the slower moving planets, we know where they are in relationship to each other. And even with that, as an astrologer, we could make some generalizations, but we can't be specific.
Right. And that brings me to a question that you referenced, which is, what is astrology?
Well, I have two ways to approach this. First way, very simple. We all know what GPS is. It's a global positioning system that allows us to see where we are in space. Astrology is a temporal positioning system. It just allows us to see where we are in time. Normally, in the Western world, we don't manage or navigate or negotiate time except by artificial constructs of the days of the week. And even the days of the week are astrological, because what we do in astrology is we take any cycle and divide it in half and divide it in half again. And what we do in our calendar, which is based upon a month, is basically rounding off the lunar cycle to 12 per year. It's really more than that, but that becomes a good average number. And we take half of the lunar cycle and we call that a fortnight. Well, we don't use that term much anymore, but there was a time in history when a fortnight was an absolute important, measurement, but a fortnight is half of a moon, and a half of a fortnight is a week, and a week is astrological because it's a moon square. It's a half of a moon cycle. And so for someone to say we need to talk about astrology and say, yeah, astrology is bullshit, I go, oh, well, that means you don't use a calendar, because our calendar is astrological, but it only references the relationship of the earth to the sun and the moon to the earth and nothing else. So what is astrology? It's a temporal mapping system that's based upon the real motions of the cosmic gears, the cosmic clockwork, if you will. And we could talk about the physics of that, but not today. And secondly, astrology is a study of correlation. It's a correlation of that which happens at the macrocosmic level to that which happens at the mesocosmic level, the microcosmic level being the subatomic, the macrocosmic being the cosmological planetary level. And astrologers are basically of the philosophy, whether they know it or not, is that these three cosms, a Greek word for order and beauty, that these three beautiful orders are somehow connected, that the mesocosm, the three-dimensional world in which we live, is in fact humming along with the macrocosm and the microcosm, as above, so below. That may be a bit much for our friend Adam Grant to take, but the concept is that basically there is a correlation between cosmic events and earthly events, period. End of story. In fact, I find it intriguing, as long as we're into not understanding what astrology is and denial, I find it intriguing that the predominant religion of the West, Christianity, the Lord's Prayer, recites, "It is done on earth as it is in heaven." And yet no one really believes that, because that's all astrology is saying. Not that I'm saying astrology must support every other aspect of Christianity or any religion. The fact of the matter is, it is done on earth as it is in heaven, period.
Oh, I love that. Going back to the article, I think we've answered a few of the questions that Adam Grant has in this article, but I just wanted to go through and see if there was anything else that you wanted to add about that. So in this article, he asks, he talks about the study that was done by the MIT team. And
it has nothing to do with astrology. It's based only upon the sun signs. And yeah, you can test for sun signs all day long, and you will not get. You may find some relevance somewhere, but it's not an important enough relevance to convince me that astrology has any validity. And in fact, there's a wonderful monograph that was published in the mid-70s. I don't know if you remember the story of Tar Baby, which I know is a bit politically incorrect these days, but Tar Baby was this thing that you got stuck all over and couldn't free yourself. And when Michel Gauquelin published his results, there was a group of scientists from Eastern universities that got together under the direction of an astronomer, George Bach, set out to discredit the Gauquelin results. And it put together an amazing group of scientists. The problem is that they got caught falsifying data to prove what they knew was the truth. And what they knew the truth was astrology was bullshit. And when their data didn't work, they began manipulating the data. And one of the people who bailed from that wrote this piece, a guy named Dennis Rollins, wrote this monograph called Star Baby, as a play on Tar Baby. And I would recommend for anyone who is not certain about whether or not astrology is worth being involved in, is this book by John Anthony West called The Case for Astrology. It's a bit sensationalized because the subtitle is "Skeptics Will Never Lightly Dismiss Astrology Again." But it's basically a 500-page book that goes through deep research on lots of levels and where the biases come in. And it's certainly not the end of the road. There are many other books I would recommend reading. For example, The History of Horoscopic Astrology. There's a lot of academic work that is, as far as I'm concerned, that is apparent that Adam Grant, who has taken his bully pulpit and to speak against astrology on, that he's never done the research. And if Adam was interested, I would give him a list of 3 or 5 or 10 or 20 books that may open his mind to the fact that, as smart as he is in what he does, he doesn't know, he's not very smart when it comes to talking about things that he doesn't know anything about. But his 5 pieces here, he says, you probably have some questions. And I think that in taking these 5 questions one at a time, each can be talked about in a sentence or two, and it might in some way help Adam understand why he's getting a bit of pushback from the minority community of people who do know something about astrology.
Right. So let's look at those questions. So the first one is, maybe the participants were trying to debunk astrology. Wouldn't we see different results among true believers?
Well, one might say that data is data. Of course, there's a group of, even in the realm of science, that says that statistics can basically prove anything. But the fact is that there are ways to get closer to objective data. And I would suggest that Adam has not done that. He's cherry picked a study, and there are 2 or 3 other studies that one could look at that would show that what people's sun signs are not necessarily the predictive tool for understanding someone's character. So I would dismiss this completely. And the goal is not to debunk astrology. The goal is to find out whether astrology is valid or not. When one says my goal is to debunk astrology, that shows that there's experimental bias even before you're out of the starting gate. And that's not what experimentation is about. It's about the experimental method of creating a hypothesis. If you want to make a hypothesis, astrology doesn't work, then you have to prove that. But that may not be the best way to make a hypothesis. One might make a hypothesis stating, is there a variable surface tension between new moons and full moons? And what does that mean to the human body? One might say, does the work of the chemist Lily Kalisko, who showed that certain crystals cannot form when the moon is aligned with certain planets that relate to the particular metal of that metal salt, does this have any meaning in human physiology? In other words, gold chloride can't make crystals when it's a new moon, and so on. I mean, there are questions that could be asked that he's not asking. And so this question of, wouldn't we see results among true believers? The answer is no. But you got to pick different questions. You got to pick questions based upon intelligence, not based upon your ignorance about what something is.
Absolutely. And the second question, I think we covered this, but the question is, wait, but birthdays matter. What about all the evidence that kids with January birthdays end up being better athletes and better students than kids born in July? And you talked about this a little with the study of Mars on the angles, for example. But is there anything else you want to add about this question?
There may be. There may be things. I mean, we all know people who are born Christmas week who hate the fact that they lose their birthday every year to Christmas. There may be things that tie into the season. And, if you're born in the summer and the weather's beautiful versus when you're born in the winter and your first few months are, kind of bundled up, and, there may be differences, but that's not what astrology is about. My question is, where was Jupiter? Where was Mars? What was the angles, and what was the relationship, between Mercury and was it moving fast, or was it between the Earth and the Sun, or on the far side of the Sun? All these things that Adam and many people would say they're irrelevant. Why would I care? And the reason that they would care is based on something that they know nothing about.
Right. The third question is about compatibility. I'm a Cancer and my best friends are Geminis and Leos. Don't people get along with their sister signs?
I received an email a number of years ago that said, I'm considering entering into a relationship after being alone for several years. What goes well with a Taurus? And I responded to that email, have you tried a 1983 Cabernet? Yes. Okay, this idea of sun sign compatibility is also a bit ridiculous. It's based upon, see, your sun sign is this. The sun sign is as close as I can imagine as to what country were you born in. In other words, if you go into a room and there's three people in that room that were born in Mumbai, and three people in that room born in New York City, and three people in that room born in Perth, Australia. In a matter of moments in conversation, you can tell who's from which city, and you could probably even make some generalizations about those people just knowing what the culture was that they were born into. However, you would know nothing about them individually. And that's what sun sign astrology does. There is some gross overall nation-like things that can be said about Geminis versus Tauruses. But the thing is that it's not that your sun is in Gemini, because as you and I know, if you were born with the sun in Gemini, chances are good that Mercury and Venus and maybe even Mars are all in Gemini too. Mm-hmm. And yet you could be born with a Gemini and have the bulk of your planets in another sign and not be like a Gemini at all. So again, there's an ignorant fallacy here based upon the idea of this sunshine. This sun sign should be able to go with that one, because there is something very potent and important about astrological compatibility, which I might add, in my experience, cannot and does not and will never predict whether a relationship is successful or not, because the word successful implies different things to different people. For some people, a successful relationship is one that lasts and leads to marriage. And I know people who have been married for 35 years who probably should have called it a good weekend. Now, I'm not a relationship cynic. I know people who have been together for 35 years who are awesome and magical. Yeah. All I'm saying is that the idea of thinking that we can take the time of year that we were born and turn that into anything meaningful in a relationship is just, it's crazy making and bullshit. And that's why someone like Adam can dismiss astrology, because I would dismiss that with him.
Right. Yeah. And compatibility is such a complex art. And like you said, it varies depending on who you're talking to and what the relationship
and when in their life you're talking to them.
Yes.
Because what's a successful relationship to me, you know, at age 20 versus age 35 may be very, very different things. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, I think it's, again, all of his questions, or at least the first four of them, are all oriented towards his fundamental misunderstanding that sun sign astrology, the time of year on the Western calendar, the Roman calendar, the Gregorian calendar, the Pope-driven Catholic calendar, that's what's important, and that basically allows the important things to slip through the cracks. Number 3.
No, actually, we're on to number 4.
Oh, number 4.
Yes, which is then why is my horoscope so accurate? And in this question, he's talking about the Barnum effect. That studies show that if you read a horoscope that you think is yours, you'll probably think it resonates. So, what would you say about this?
Well, first of all, when he's talking about a horoscope, I assume he's talking about a sun sign horoscope, which, as someone who actually wrote them in a former lifetime, well, in this lifetime, where I had some 10 to 20 million readers every day, I'm not a stranger to that world. And it's been said that sun sign astrology is actually the gateway drug to real horoscopic astrology, meaning there's something there that gets people, but I would agree that horoscopic, that daily horoscopes based on your sun sign, largely are based upon generalizations that you could read you could read 12 signs and pick 3 and go, those are me. And one of them might be yours, or, you know, by your sun sign, and maybe not. And so the question is not, why is my sun sign so accurate? The real question is, I've seen a competent astrologer in an individual consultation. I don't understand how that person could have known all the important dates of my life and picked out the important issues that it took 2 years of psychotherapy for my psychologist to get to. How is that possible? That would be a different question. And that's a valid question.
Mm-hmm.
But the question of why do people believe what they read in their sun signs? Why do people believe the news? Why do people believe anything? Yeah, there's a fool born every minute. Thank you, P.T. Barnum.
But also, I would say that if you think about astrology in context of Carl Jung, for example, talking about
which I do.
Yep, and I do too. Talking about astrology as being, a gateway into synchronicity, and that information comes, messages come, that there are these synchronistic happenings that we're a part of. I don't think you can negate sun sign astrology, because if you read something that's meaningful, then that is, like you're saying, it can be a gateway, but it can also be a moment of enlightenment, a breakthrough moment where you understand something about yourself or about the divine.
Look, Rachel, I wouldn't have invested 20 years of my life writing a sun sign column that was daily, the horoscope column that people read on the internet. It was the column on AOL, MySpace, Yahoo.com, Google.com, Huffington Post, LA Times. And I wrote every day stuff that I thought could be useful, valid, and helpful to the people reading it. So I'm not dismissing it as dumb and irrelevant. I'm only saying it's not the real astrology that we practice.
Yep. Beautiful. And I know as someone who writes monthly horoscopes that I put a lot of attention and thought into it, and a lot of, I like to think that I'm writing things that would be meaningful to someone.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
But let's move on to the next question, the last question, which is yes, this one. But the moon's gravitational pull causes the tides. Can't celestial objects affect us too?
And Adam's answer is not through gravity. And I would agree with him here partially, but I would not agree with him at all. Well, the second part is the planets exert virtually no gravitational force on humans. It's infinitesimally small, and he relates it to 7 trillion times less than the force of the pillow on your head. The problem here is the problem that hardcore physicists ran into when, at the beginning of the 20th century, they began to try to understand what was going on what we now call the microcosm or subatomic level. And they realized that somehow or other that these subatomic events that we call electrons or protons or neutrons were not obeying the laws of gravitational cause and effect, and that these particles were not behaving in the billiard ball mechanical way that we assumed that they should based upon Newtonian mechanics, which is mechanics that work. Look, using Johannes Kepler, who, as we know, was an astrologer who made his planetary mechanical breakthroughs because he was driven to do that because of his astrology work. But the breakthroughs of Johannes Kepler and Isaac Newton enables us to send a projectile a couple of billion miles on a trajectory around the sun, picking up speed from the orbit of Venus, being thrown around the other side, and having a collision with an asteroid the size of a few football fields. This shit works. I'm not doubting that there's something to gravity and to mechanical interactions of cause and effect billiard ball relationships. Billiard ball meaning when one billiard ball hits another at a certain trajectory with a certain speed and a certain spin, that ball will then go this way, and that the rocket will land at this point on this building or whatever. However, we have a problem. And the problem is a problem that befuddled the explorers into these subatomic realms when they began to realize that these particles weren't just particles, they were actually some sort of vibratory events, and that there's this thing called the particle wave duality. And you see, even Isaac Newton knows, and I go to a discussion that I had many years ago with the theoretical physicist Fred Allen Wolf, who reminded me that even Isaac Newton had this gravitational constant that he called gravitational potential. which is based upon the angular momentum of an object rather than the normal de-attenuation by the inverse square of the distance. I know that's a lot for people who may not have ever heard this first time, but what Adam Grant is talking about is that if you have gravity and you go 10 times farther away, the gravity is less by 10 times 10 or 100. And so that the farther you go away, as you go further away in distance, the gravity gets less exponentially. So an object like Pluto, that's, the size of, large football. No, I mean, very large, but it's not very big at all. That Pluto, that's 2 billion miles away, can have any impact on us gravitationally. I 100% agree. But that's not what's going on, because as we know now from the Nobel Prize that was awarded to a man named Alain Aspect, a Swiss physicist who won the Nobel Prize for a concept that originally was developed by John Wheeler at Princeton at the Advanced Research. That's where Albert Einstein was. And John Wheeler's concept is something that physicists call non-locality. Some people refer to it as entanglement, but it basically, Alain Aspect demonstrated that two electrons that were close together once, even if they're infinitely far apart, somehow still know what the other one's doing. That's not limited by the speed of light. Physicists call this non-locality. And it basically says that the mechanical de-attenuation of gravity is not the only mechanism that goes on. And I just want to end this with just this thought, and that is that I remember back in I think it was in the early 90s, maybe late 80s, that we had sent this object that was the size of a large beach ball, that was a satellite or a projectile that went out and sent back photographs of Neptune. And I remember that this object, the size probably of smaller than someone's room, 1 billion miles away, made the front cover of Time magazine, reproduced several 100 million times, or several, maybe tens of millions of times, have a picture on the cover. How can something so far away make something happen here? That this idea of gravity being the only mechanism of information transmission was fine until we discovered electromagnetism. There are waveforms that travel at the speed of light that don't seem to de-attenuate with distance. It's why you can tune your radio and pick up a radio station from the other side of the world, or why we can, in fact, get radio signals from a rover on Mars, because this transmitter is smaller than a small room, and yet it's getting instantaneous recognition here. And in fact, we know that the planets going around the sun create channels of energy on the sun that seem to go in synchronicity, not synchronicity, in synchrony, I think is the right word. It's synchronous relationship to those orbits. And I would pose the idea that the particle wave duality, which means that at the subatomic level, we know light travels like a wave. We can measure it. But we know that when we go to measure it in that moment, we perceive it as a particle. And this particle wave duality.
SpaceX just launched just now, this moment. It felt like a huge earthquake.
Oh, that's right. You're near Vandenberg, aren't you? You're near
my gosh. Yeah. That was so wild. It was like this pow just happened.
Wow. I love it. I wish we could have that recorded. Well, we do now. We have it memorialized.
So
the punchline, the punchline here is that at the subatomic level, when we measure a wave, it seems like a particle, and yet when we're not measuring it, somehow goes back to being a wave. And this conundrum has puzzled physicists for for about a century now. And I would suggest that what we perceive as the moon or Jupiter or Pluto or Saturn are actually particles. I call them BFPs. big fucking particles. But they're still particles.
Uh-huh.
But when we're not looking at the moon, oh, look, it's a new moon or a crescent, just after a new moon, or look, it's a full moon and it's being eclipsed. Wow, I'm seeing this big particle.
Mm-hmm.
But when I'm not looking at it, that moon is humming at 13 cycles a year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Saturn is humming at 3 cycles a century. A
Mm-hmm.
little bit faster than that. But Pluto is humming at 4 cycles a millennium. But these are basically ultra, 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 very, very low frequency vibrations
Mm-hmm.
that, just like every other vibration, whether it's A above middle C at 440 cycles a second, making those beats against my eardrum, creating concert tuning, or whether it's some lower frequency note, or whether it's the waves at a seashore coming up and down, that the planets are really particles in the particle wave duality. And we have not scientifically instrumented any of these waves because they're so low frequency. How do you measure? Well, I know how you measure, a computer's rhythm at 4.77 trillion cycles a second. That's 4.77 gigahertz. Or how we instrument the color green, which is several hundred trillion cycles a second. Or even on AM radio, which is only, let's say, 530,000 cycles a second. How do you measure something that's 3 cycles a century? Oh, it's Saturn. Let's get a beat. All we need to do is wait 30 years for the second beat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Science doesn't do that. Science can't do that.
Yeah.
And this is why astrology is outside of the normal realms of instrumentation, which is based upon a precise measurement of repeatable oscillation. And yet I would suggest here to Adam and other people that there are mechanisms here at play that they don't understand, that we have not instrumented, and that they don't understand because they don't even know that these things actually exist. They're caught in this popular assumption based upon an invention of a 20th century astrologer, Alan Leo, who, when pressured to write something for the Daily Mirror in England in the early 1900s, came up with this idea of sun signs. I mean, in traditional astrology, the sun is a point, but there was never any, so what's your sign? Oh, you mean where was the earth in relationship to the sun when I was born? Why is that more important than the moon's relationship to the earth or Mercury's relationship to both? So this whole idea of sun sign astrology is basically part of a bad PR nightmare.
Well, Rick, I think, I could talk to you for hours and hours about this and take this in lots of different directions. But unfortunately, we have hit the end of our time together. So
well, let's schedule another time down the road.
Yeah, let's do. I would love that. And where can people find you if they want to learn more about your work or join your membership?
Well, a lot of my work online right now would probably be over the head of an Adam Grant, because it's assuming that you're not lost in the misconception that astrology is stupidly related only to the birthday and not year and not time of date of that in which you were born. But one can find me on YouTube at youtube.com/ and they use an @ now, Rick Levine. So that's the fastest way to find me on YouTube, is at Rick Levine. And on Patreon, also, it's patreon.com/Rick Levine. On I mean, Google Rick Levine for better and or for worse. I'm all over the place, but a lot of it may be stuff that that you won't be interested in if you've never thought about astrology as anything more than I'm an Aries, you're a vegetarian, and that person's moon's in crises or whatever.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Rick. And thank you all for listening, for watching. We are going to close with our cosmic call to action, which is your weekly activity to bring the heavens and the earth together in your own life. And so, in the spirit of the conversation that we had today, your cosmic call to action is to go get your birth chart. Find out where the planets were at the time of your birth. You can find that on my website, rachellangastrologer.com. Right on the front page, it says create your birth chart. You can also go to websites like AstroTheme, astro.com, and there are so many resources. You could find apps on your phone. Time Nomad is one that's free, Time Passages. But check out your birth chart, find out a little bit more about who you are, and start to open your mind to the way that astrology can help you in your life.
And although this is your podcast, not mine,
Uh-huh.
I would like to end it with the same way I end almost all of my internet related social media things. And that is think cosmically, but act locally.
I love that. Think cosmically, act locally.
If we don't bring this stuff down to earth, like you said, if we don't bring the heavens into our immediate life, why bother doing all of this? It's just sophism.
I couldn't agree more.
Then don't.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Rick.
Thank you.